That was such a tremendous way to kick this off, because I think what you got to hear was there's a huge opportunity for these two initiatives in federal government to work together, to collaborate, to learn from each other, to build relationships between federal contracting community and the AbilityOne nonprofit community to achieve a greater outcome and greater opportunity for people with disabilities in the workplace. I've been describing it as taking one slice of pie and not replacing it with another, but actually growing the pie entirely. I'm Julian Cosgrove, Vice President of Government and Public Relations at Melwood, and I am really excited to be able to start this conversation and have all of you here. Hang on, let me find my little notes. We are really excited about the next panel. We are going to be talking about the AbilityOne program and the nonprofit of the future, because as we've laid this out in the earlier conversation, there's modernization and advancement to be made here. So we are excited to introduce our next panel, and I am so pleased to be joined by these esteemed colleagues and friends that are really thoughtful about the future of the AbilityOne program and how this can really become the pipeline to the future employment for so many people with disabilities and who are blind across the country. So I'm pleased to introduce Molly Reisner, who at the Federal Times, she's a reporter who's really focused on these issues of labor and employment, particularly in the federal contracting space, and she'll be our moderator for the panel to explore AbilityOne. Come on up.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to our second panel of the day, Built to Last, the NPA of the Future. Before I go ahead and introduce our panelists, I'll just kind of set the stage a little bit about the discussion that we're about to have. As you all know, the AbilityOne program is the largest collective source of employment for people who are blind or have significant disabilities. And for about 90 years, the program has provided meaningful employment and career opportunities. But I think many of us can agree that it could do with modernization. And so with the release of the final 898 panel report and the 2022 through 2026 fiscal year strategic plan for the AbilityOne program, social enterprises must prepare and plan for the future of the program for both business and employers. And so in this session, we're going to examine a couple of the key pillars of the strategic plan, discuss how to adapt for a future that serves the double bottom line, and of course, lay the groundwork for future discussions about how AbilityOne can be leveraged to help federal contractors achieve their compliance goals. So with that, I would like to welcome our speakers. All right, we have Julie Christensen, Executive Director for the Association of People Supporting Employment First. You can applaud if you wish. And we also have Ms. Melissa Gary, the AbilityOne Program Executive within the Office of Acquisition Policy at the General Services Administration. And of course, we have Larissa Kautz, President and CEO of Melwood. We'll go ahead and kick things off with a question for Larissa. So the AbilityOne program, as we just kind of talked about, has been around for nearly 90 years. And while the legislation has not changed since about the 70s, talking about the need for modernization, nonprofits participating in the program have drastically changed their business models, especially in the past decade. And so what are some of the changes that you've seen around how nonprofits have operated and adapted?
Oh, thank you for the question. Is my mic working? Yes, I think, okay. So by the way, I'm filling in for Charlotte Hammond, who couldn't make it because of a sickness, so pardon me as I answer these questions off the top of my head. So the way that we've seen nonprofits in the program change is, as the law has evolved and as the policy has evolved around disability employment, we have evolved along with it. Mm-hmm. When the WIOA came out and you really talked about competitive integrated employment, a lot of us really took that seriously and, phased out the use of 14C and the payment of sub-minimum wages. Melwood gave that up voluntarily. I think it's about 5-6 years ago now. We've been moving away from the sheltered workshop model and making sure that, particularly in the services industry, people are employed in an integrated, inclusive environment. And We've become a little more sophisticated in terms of our own kind of corporate governance. A lot of the nonprofits in the program have separated out into two corporate entities, their contract services arm and their service provider arm, to try to kind of get away from the inherent kind of conflict of interest that some believe exists with being a service provider and an employer in one entity, because there is the fear that when you're providing services, you're doing intake for people with disabilities, and you're helping guide them on a path to a job or a career, that there is this fear that you could be a bad actor and just shuffle them all into your AbilityOne contracts to help fill those and to have employment for those folks. So, a lot of us in the program have worked very hard to set up that wall, to set up the different structures to make sure that doesn't exist. Because really, at our heart, we are nonprofits. We have a charitable mission to advocate for and empower people with disabilities. And we want them to be in the job that makes them passionate, that fulfills them, that gives them the career growth and opportunities that they want. And so while the Javits-Wagner-O'Day Act hasn't been amended, I think a lot of the concerns that are inherent with the structure of the program have been put aside by some of us in the program. There's still work to do, and it was really great to hear Kim and Kai talk about the change to the program that has to happen to the statute with regulation, with policy. But really, a lot of us are serving people with disabilities in a way that is competitive, that is integrated, paying prevailing wages. People with disabilities are in unions. They're leading some union sites. So I'm very proud of that.
Sounds like, NPAs that really have to find where they can tease out some flexibility while waiting for the legislation to catch up.
Absolutely.
For Julie, a question for you. So would you say that the current model for helping people with disabilities become gainfully employed in the community is working? We'll start with that.
I'm going to piggyback off of Larissa's question, and to full disclosure for those of you who don't know about the Association for People Supporting Employment First, we're an organization that 5 years ago probably wouldn't have been in this room, because we're an organization that has advocated heavily for the elimination of 14C. We believe in competitive integrated employment. Before that was a word that was or a phrase codified in law. But the things that Larissa is describing, I think, are things that we as a national organization are recognizing create possibility. And so there are things that are working. There's a lot that needs to be fixed. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that AbilityOne across every aspect really is competitive integrated employment. But there are a lot of pockets of incredible excellence and creativity where we have seen NPAs figure it out. And the way we learned about this and having to shift our messaging around the AbilityOne program, and it's a tightrope walk for me as executive director, we have more and more NPAs that are joining our ranks, that are coming to APSI and saying, you guys have been at the forefront of moving away from these segregated sub-minimum wage models for a very long time. We need your help to figure it out. And so, I think what's working, to Larissa's point, is the creativity and the shift in mindset, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of pushback. And so how we figure out how to lift up the Melwoods of the world who are figuring things out within the constraints of what JWAD and other regulations require. We also, APSI as an organization, has a responsibility to partner on things like, how do we change JWAD? How do we break down those policy barriers that get in the way of competitive integrated employment? But what I would say is that the AbilityOne program, with its flaws, without it, I worry about the employment rate of people with disabilities. I do not, I'm a pragmatist, I suppose, but I'm also a hippie from Berkeley. And I just don't have faith in the for-profit sector to pick this up and to have the commitment to employing people with disabilities in the same way that the not-for-profit sector is. So I think it's an and conversation, not an or, if that is a fair way to put that.
Well, I always say that my hope as a nonprofit, and I think any nonprofit, is to eventually not have to exist anymore, right? Our vision is a world in which people with disabilities are fully included. If we can get to that vision, I am happy to not have to be in the nonprofit space anymore. I'll find another good mission to follow. And that's why I think conversations like today are so important, because we're trying to make that movement on the for-profit sector, how to marry what we're doing with 503 and get us on that path to hopefully finding a way for employers to understand the importance of this and the value to them of this.
I will say, if there's one thing that I would put out as a challenge, and I don't know if Hy's still in the room, but she had made the point about we can't force people to leave an AbilityOne program. I agree with that. There's forcing, and then there's actually partnering with people with disabilities to help them understand the array of options that are available to them beyond the AbilityOne program. AbilityOne creates tremendous opportunities for training, but in so many cases, it becomes the de facto destination, and there's more we can do there.
Mm-hmm. And bottom line, it sounds like attention is better than inattention in having these conversations.
Absolutely.
You mentioned also, the 14C certificates on contract, which the program recently eliminated. So, the next big phase is then to encourage greater adoption, more integration. Can you talk about how APSI is supporting those efforts?
So I think the product side of AbilityOne is the hardest to accomplish, and we've had lots of conversations about that. That really requires congressional action on JWAD, and we are working in partnership with Melwood, with Source America, with NIB, with the Commission on thinking through what that could look like and what proposals we should be bringing forward for the change to JWAD. On the services side, it's interesting, and Larissa brought up the point of, there is a concern about providers being employers, and I also feel that deeply in my advocacy bones. And I recognize that the not-for-profit sector is the largest sector for employment possibilities. And so we have to kind of grapple with that. How do we create space where providers can also employ people with disabilities and also keep the bad actors in check who are doing some of the things that have created real concern for the disability advocacy community. That being said, I had to be challenged myself even 5-6 years ago to get out and actually see some of these jobs in real life. Because to be honest, AbilityOne in 2022 is not even AbilityOne 5 years ago. And my own community, my own members are probably the slowest to be willing to hear that. But sometimes it just means you have to be willing to open your eyes and have a conversation. In some respects, in the for-profit sector, we see, Fortune 100 companies who subcontract out, and through service providers are having job coaches providing supports for people with disabilities, and functionally it is no different than what our not-for-profit providers are doing. The only difference is the name on the paycheck. In the for-profit world, we're okay with that. If IBM, let's just say, I don't know, wow, I'm a 90s kid. If an IBM is going to subcontract their janitorial services, and that janitorial service provider happens to be the employer of a person with a disability, we're okay with IBM doing that. They have committed to helping increase and message around disability employment. When it's not IBM, when it's a Melwood, we have a different fear, very real and well-deserved fear around the potential exploitation of people with disabilities. And we need to ask some hard questions, but I think we also need to be open to the notion that there are probably some good actors that are trying to do the right thing. So, I think that's where I see we really have to do some of the work around education, around just opening avenues to have these conversations, to be perfectly honest. Because I think there's tremendous possibility, and I don't think that the answer, although I might have said this even 10 years ago in my career. I don't think the answer is, let's just blow it all up and start all over, right? I think we can build on the success that we have.
And that's a perfect segue, talking about education, and almost, the common thread through all of these conversations has been bridging gaps, whether in misconceptions, understanding. And so the AbilityOne program and its representatives embedded in the federal government play a huge piece in that. Sure. So Melissa, I wanted to ask you, one of the biggest challenges has been establishing kind of a prevalence of ABORs. But can you talk a little bit about how important that is for agencies to invest in them? Talk a little about what their primary role is and how they fit into this conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Let me start by saying GSA, as an agency, believes in and fully supports the AbilityOne program. And we've been a supporter for some time. And given the mission of GSA, we can offer some unique insights into how we feel, or the activities we feel will enhance and expand the AbilityOne program. But the real bottom line is that agencies need to invest more in identifying opportunities, employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Now, we've seen for decades the value that small business advocates have brought to the table for small businesses. And having ABORs, and particularly in some of the large procuring agencies, performing a similar role, will help us increase AbilityOne awareness and utilization. Many of our contracting offices have not been exposed to the AbilityOne program, particularly if their needs are outside of the traditional AbilityOne products and services. So in this vein, the ABORs can help to educate and serve as ambassadors for the AbilityOne program. A case in point I'm going to use is the Air Force. They've demonstrated the potential of a robust ABOR program by holding semi-annual reviews and having their subcomponent ABORs present to senior leadership so that this information is flowed up to the top and they're aware of what's going on. At GSA, the ABOR team has conducted outreach, and we do quarterly trainings to make sure our folks, not only within GSA, because we've gone outside of GSA as well, to do government-wide training, know what AbilityOne offers and how to access the program. These actions help ensure the continued success of the AbilityOne program, and this is the type of investment that federal agencies also need to make to help increase utilization of the program. Now, in addition to that, starting this fiscal year, we implemented individual strategic action plans for both of GSA's major services, the Federal Acquisition Service as well as the Public Building Services. And the purpose of these plans is to identify potential opportunities for AbilityOne and to assure that AbilityOne is given consideration during the market research and the acquisition planning phases. We also continue to increase our annual AbilityOne pledge since FY21. I'm not sure what other agencies are doing, but with the issuance of the OFPP memo, where they asked agencies to establish a 1% bottom line pledge, we have increased that pledge each year, and we will continue to do so. I just feel that as other agencies invest time and personnel in ABOR activities, I am confident that we will see customer knowledge and satisfaction increase. I believe we'll also see employment opportunities for people with disabilities expand.
And I think that helps kind of, give a little bit of context, to the program and why it's so important. You sort of alluded to it a little bit, but opportunities for growth for AbilityOne and, of course, for the ABOR program. So
yes.
Do you envision growth as government-wide, having more embedded? Do you envision, you talked about pledges and really increasing those year over year, but where do you see opportunities to grow that program?
Opportunities to grow the AbilityOne program. No, I think we at GSA are doing our part to grow and expand utilization of the program, But again, it can't just be one agency. This has got to be a concerted effort across government. In terms of program growth, there's room to achieve greater market penetration, meaning selling more of the same products and services, but to new customers as they become more familiar with the program. I also think, however, that the real potential for growth is greatest in developing new markets, new lines of businesses, and selling those new services and products to both current and new customers. The AbilityOne program is only scratching the surface in providing services like IT, help desk support, cybersecurity, contract and grant administration support, and financial management support. That's just scratching the surface of what these NPAs can provide. And A boards are extremely instrumental in supporting program growth, so having more would be helpful. More A boards coupled with the work that we already do is serving as a conduit to help vendors engage and better understand the perspectives of the government and of contracting officers, because sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect, you know. It's not that we want different things. I think we all want best products, you know, best value, okay? And I was part of the team that helped rewrite FAR Part 15 and introduced the notion of best value. So that's pretty near to me. But I think we all want that. Bottom line, we want that. Vendors want that. The federal government wants that. So what we want to achieve at the end of the day is customer satisfaction and successful outcomes. This will help expand the program too. I'd like to point out too that the success of the AbilityOne program is ultimately the success of the American people. Helping people with disabilities means protecting their wages, providing avenues to economic independence, and allowing for investments in things like home ownership and higher education, not only for these individuals, but for their families as well.
So talking about, you know, kind of the really lofty goals that we have for this and the long-term trajectory that we want to see for the program, bringing it down to something that folks in our audience who are familiar with contracting, work in contracting, can take away today about how to do things better, do things different. So if you could give advice to contracting officers, you know, what do they in their everyday job need to understand principally about how to engage with AbilityOne? And that can go for anyone who has a thought.
Okay.
I'll start if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely.
So I actually would shift the question to whoever it is above those contracting officers that's in charge of helping them get educated in various aspects of our procurement system. First needs to make them aware of the AbilityOne program. Exactly. I think if you have a contracting officer that's aware of the AbilityOne program, then I feel like you've already bypassed the biggest hurdle. But you know, there are small things and bigger things we could do. You know, the first sheet of a contract in the federal contracting space has check boxes, whether it's an SBA contract, whether it's a disadvantaged business, those things. There is no box for AbilityOne. Frankly, it's small things like that honestly, if every single cover sheet of every single federal contract just had a box for it, I feel like you would already will have reached a goal of making sure that at least every single contractor in our country would look at it and maybe ask the question, what is this? And look into it more. And then I think, and this is part of the 898 panel, and I think as well the strategic plan for AbilityOne is to do a lot more outreach and education to contracting officers, well, whether it's part of the Defense Acquisition University courses or other things. And I'd love to push this as much as we can, because the more contracting officers that know that this is something they could do, it's something they could do in almost a sole source way that's outside of the regular big frame of competition, which makes their job easier. I think, and the ABORs, I think, have a really big role in that and have taken the lead on a lot of that education.
Absolutely, Larissa. You know, in some of the training that we do, there is a real hunger to understand the AbilityOne program. The last training session that we did, it was government-wide. We had more than 800 people online.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so they really want to know more about the program, and that knowledge will trigger utilization of the program. So my advice to COs is to make sure you have a clear understanding of the program. What is the procurement list? And understand what's possible. What's on the procurement list now is not set in perpetuity. That list can be added too, okay? I would also encourage them to use FAR Clause 52208-9, where appropriate, even in contracts where you're not dealing with AbilityOne vendors.
Amen.
Okay? Yeah, that's one of the biggest things that we're pushing for. Make sure you use that clause. And truly, I've heard excuses from, well, we don't want to limit where vendors go to secure their goods and services. Well, guess what, contracting officer, and I love contracting officers. I've been one twice. You know, this is mandatory on us as the federal government. So we have an obligation to flow this down to our vendors. If they're using our sources of supply, AbilityOne is one of those sources. So you have to use that clause. Also, where possible, consider designing requirements in a way that encourages subcontracting with AbilityOne NPAs. And by that I mean, for example, if you're building a building, okay, sure, from an administrative standpoint, it's easier to give this whole building to one vendor, okay, and let them figure out how they're going to get it done. But you know, when you're building a building, there's a lot that goes on the outside, there's a lot that goes on the inside, there's drywall, there's painting, things like that. Consider AbilityOne. Is this something that the AbilityOne vendors can provide? And if so, you can carve out that piece for AbilityOne. So definitely consider that. Now, Molly, I also have some advice for NPAs.
Bring it.
Okay. And what I would encourage them to do is to understand the concerns that COs have, okay? Once upon a time, the government looked at long-term relationships as a good thing, okay? But we've found that oftentimes that's not the best road because we get too familiar with each other, right? and we kind of slack off. So contracting officers are a little bit leery about entering long-term relationships or contracting relationships with vendors. Because again, we don't want the quality to slip. We don't want the prices to get to a point where they're unreasonable, okay? But one way to help with this reluctance is to present the program's capabilities and opportunities with some flexibility. Now, I know one of the things that the commission is looking into is to add requirements to the procurement list in a time-limited manner, okay? So, because one of the perceptions is once you put something in the AbilityOne program, it is set in perpetuity. You can't ever, ever, ever get it out. So if the performance slips, you're basically stuck with it. That is a misconception, okay? AbilityOne contracts can be terminated. But again, if we employ some flexibility, right, when we're talking to contracting officers, that will go a long ways in kind of diminishing some of the angst that they have. Also, more often than not, the customer will want to extend the relationship, especially if it's great, okay, and they find it easy to work with the NPAs, and that they're receiving best value. And I think the panel before talked about it's not always the lowest cost. You know, what we're seeking is best value. And the way to look at best value is as a continuum, right? On one end, you have LPTA, lowest cost, you know, technically acceptable. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have trade-offs, right? Whichever way you go, should always result in best value, okay? So one is not at the exclusion of the other. So, but again, make sure that what you're offering is best value, okay? Talk to the contracting officers, be a little bit more flexible, understand some of the concerns that they have.
And there's a lot of folks in this room who can also help answer questions about, learning more and getting kind of better acquainted and talking about those kinds of things too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
What I think was really great that came up on the last panel was Kai was talking about, the best value component of it, including the jobs that are being provided and the impact on the individuals with disabilities, whether there is a potential for them to grow up and out even in the programs. I think that the really good point to make is to make sure that that best value includes that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, we have to start thinking differently. We have to approach helping or supporting the AbilityOne program and people with disabilities from a whole of government perspective. Yeah. Even if the price that you're paying for a product or service is a little bit higher than what you might be able to get it for commercially, think about the back end. By hiring these people with disabilities and paying them a good wage, right? On the back end, it's going to reduce reliance on disability payments, right? So we save on that end. Mm-hmm. So again, if we look at this from a whole of government perspective, as opposed to just what's good for me right now in this moment, and I don't care what happens on the back end, I think that will go a long ways to change the mindset of individuals, of federal agencies and contracting officials.
If I could just react.
Mm-hmm.
So I started my career in the corporate side, and now finding myself in a world that is mostly either government mm-hmm. or not-for-profit. Mm-hmm. Everything you're describing is how the rest of the world works, right? Mm-hmm. So, there is a certain amount of us within our own space really thinking about what we mean when we are talking about equity. Mm-hmm. We have to have the same thought processes that the private sector has, and all the things you're talking about, particularly with private sector interest and investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Yes. Everything you've just described are the same thought processes that our Fortune 500 companies are having right now.
Yes. And I am so happy that the federal government has finally jumped on that bandwagon. Yeah, absolutely.
Those are great points. So a question kind of for each of you to sort of offer your unique perspective on, but the 2022 through 2026 strategic plan is sort of the North Star in all of this. Mm-hmm. And we're talking a lot about growth in the future. That's a vision where the AbilityOne program becomes a broader ecosystem. We're mm-hmm. advancing CIE and of course expanding the quality job opportunities for folks with disabilities. So for each of you, I'd love to hear, what are you most excited for about the future of the program?
Mm-hmm. You want me to start?
Go ahead.
You're all looking at me.
Sure.
So my Machiavellian plan for having this conference and starting the conversation around 503 and AbilityOne is to continue to expand this conversation and talk about SBA and AbilityOne and 503, and then 501 and 503 and AbilityOne mm-hmm. and SBA, because I think for a long time, AbilityOne was seen as the silo. This is the program where people with disabilities are hired, and whenever a lot of advocates would come to SBA and say, hey, can we create a specific category for disability-owned businesses, or can we create a hiring incentive for small businesses to hire people with disabilities? The answer mm-hmm. traditionally has been, well, AbilityOne does that. And 503 and 501 finally came with the Rehabilitation Act and focused on government direct hiring for people with disabilities, mm-hmm. as well as this aspirational goal for federal contractors under mm-hmm. 503. But again, it was done siloed from AbilityOne. It was like, we're doing this over here, and we're going to try these things over here. Mm-hmm. And what I love about the AbilityOne Commission and Director Yang and Melissa Gary and others talking is that now it needs to be a conversation to see how each of those programs can feed the other
exactly.
In a really good kind of concentric circle Venn diagram, because We have 60 years of experience in the AbilityOne program for recruiting, onboarding, training, retaining, and managing individuals' with disabilities, and really showing how to make the jobs accessible and successful. And the private sector is just starting to figure this out. You know, the Autism at Work initiatives are really great, but I got to tell you, it's such a small number of people that are working through that program, but it's a start. And you know, with MITRE, we have a program where we're working with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency to help them fulfill their 501 hiring goals. And you know, we are doing the AbilityOne program where we train the individuals in the specific skills and professional development that they need, and then having a staffing arrangement for 6 months where there are employees, and then once they get their security clearance, they transition over to NGA. There's so many pilots like that we can do with agencies, because it's not just about AbilityOne entities hiring people. It's about the government hiring, for-profit contractors hiring, small businesses being encouraged to hire. If all of those powers of procurement can be harnessed, man, the change that we could make.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Larissa, on that note, I guess I'm a little bit radical in my thinking, but
What?
yeah, you know, I see a space where SBA can play a big role here, okay? When you look at SBA's definition of socially and economically disadvantaged, right? It's focused around ethnicity, gender, race, okay? Well, why not expand that to include people with disabilities? Because we know these individuals are socially and economically disadvantaged, right? So I've talked to some of my colleagues in government, and I'm like, why can't we start this conversation with SBA? Now, I'm pretty certain there's going to be pushback, right? But I've also received calls from small businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and they want to know how they can support the AbilityOne program. How can I get an AbilityOne contract? Well, unfortunately, you can't, because you are a for-profit entity, right? But there is some room in the subcontracting arena. And I thought, this is a wonderful idea. These are people who themselves have disabilities. Who better to have an understanding or to have empathy and sympathy and understanding for other people with disabilities? So one of the things that I'm excited about the strategic plan is the fact that it's seeking to create these pipelines, right, that are outside of the AbilityOne program, to work with commercial entities, to work with small businesses, and even large businesses, to create these pipelines where people within the NPAs who work for the NPAs, if they choose to, you know, expand upward and outward beyond that, they're able to. There's a platform, there's a pipeline for them to do that. I think that is just absolutely awesome.
Can I answer opposite?
Of course.
So here's one of the things I don't love about the strategic plan. I was pretty disappointed in the decision to pivot away from really leaning into the language of competitive integrated employment. And I understand the politics behind why, but I'll tell you, if we're going to continue to put different language on how we describe outcomes for people with disabilities in employment, good jobs, optimal jobs, come on, we don't talk about that outside of the disability space. And what competitive integrated employment within WIOA was intended to do was to level the playing field and to say that all people, regardless of whether you have a disability or not, are able to have good jobs with competitive wages, working alongside everybody else, where the entire labor market is open to you. That's what we're talking about. And so, you know, there's a lot in the strategic plan that I love. Obviously, APSI was cheering for moving away entirely from 14C. That was a big piece that we've been advocating for since the 1990s. That was huge. But when we talk about room for growth, I think that there's opportunity within our own community to say, you know, what is it that we're really talking about? And until every job meets that standard of competitive integrated employment, then we're not where we need to be.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I know people within the AbilityOne program are very proud of their work. I mean, we saw the heroism, you know, during the height of the COVID pandemic, right? How they increased shifts. They worked on the weekends, right? They were on the front line serving and providing protective equipment for federal agencies and for others who needed it. You know, they just did not stop. So, as I said, I know they're very proud, and I've had the opportunity to visit a site where they were providing contract management services. And I mean, they had to call me away. It's like, okay, Melissa, it's time to go. I was just so, you know, enthralled by the technology, and, you know, they just set me down and say, okay, let me show you how this works. And I am just floored by this. So they are very, very, very proud of the work that they do. And I'd really like to see more opportunities for them to become federal employees and engage in other public sector careers, you know, to further expand their knowledge and their skill sets. So that's one of the things I'm excited about. And I understand, I hear what you're saying. But, you know, sometimes it's baby steps.
100%. The advocate in me just can't lose the opportunity to say it.
Yes, I understand.
Great points made there. I want to make sure that we have some time for audience questions if there are any. So at this time, if there are, it is your moment. Coming around with the mic.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Chapman-Deal from TVS in Brevard, North Carolina. And I just wanted to thank Melwood for putting this on and you ladies for coming out today. And I just wanted to kind of piggyback off your last comment. We're an NPA that was founded in 1967 by a civic organization, kind of unusual for that. Mostly it's parents who were looking for something different, but it was a group called the JCs, if any of y'all are familiar with them, who founded our organization. We didn't get an AbilityOne contract till 2000. We have looked for ways. We are the largest employer in our community, the largest private employer behind the hospital and the school. We live in a very rural community, and we work hard to find opportunities for our people, though we provide some of the best jobs in our county. We put $27 million into a little bitty county. So during the pandemic last year, we went from working 2 shifts, 8 hours a day, with a cleaning shift for third. And by the way, we produce products. We do dried milk, for low-fat milk for USDA, and we do a product called Super Cereal for USAID and the World Food Program. Because of the pandemic, food pantry use went up 60%. We went from running 5 days a week, 2 shifts, 8-hour shifts, to 24/7. All of us in the building who were not essential workers, 75% whom are still in the building, went home so that we could allow those people to come in. We also provide services, and I think you mentioned that that is kind of a odd place, so I'd like to invite anybody in here who would love to come and see TVS to come see what we do. We're open and willing and able. We also had to stop our services, and we took an enormous loss. It only took us 2.5 months to figure out how to provide those services again. And if it weren't for our federal contracts, there's no way we would have been able to serve those other 50 people who are at home that we provide services to every day for adult daycare. We provide services in their homes. So one of the things that the federal government does well is use its power to help us support communities. Now, I'm all for growing this, and we'll take every contract that we have the capability to take. But what happens is services are different. You put your money into people. Products, which we're a tiny little niche now, even though originally, as Hy pointed out, that's how it started out. It's a huge investment for us. It's an investment. We automated. A lot of people say, how in the world did you automate? We automated so that when we need to take the automation away, we take the automation away, because while we produce products, the bottom line for us is the jobs. That is why we exist, is the jobs. And that is what I would love to say to every contracting officer that would like to come and visit, because we do what needs to be done for the most marginalized population in the United States. And we talked about self-identification a little bit earlier today. There are 20 million people who are looking for jobs, and I know some in my community. A lot of them are limited by lack of transportation. So that's something that we've been working on. But if we self-identify, which I want us all to, I don't identify. I have a daughter with a physical disability. I'm a parent of a disabled child with cerebral palsy. I cannot imagine the number of people that there would be out there who would be looking for jobs. My guess, upwards of 80 million. We are talking about providing jobs to a large section of the United States. So we better strap our seatbelts on if that's where we're headed, because there's going to be a lot of good work to do in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. If I can ask, where are you located?
Brevard, North Carolina, in
Okay.
the western part of North Carolina.
Okay,
Please come on down. It's all
I'd like to.
well, let's talk after this.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Lori Kane from Global Connections to Employment, and my question is regarding like the aid wars. And we were talking about the relationships, which are so important. And I just kind of want to touch base on the Army side of it, because they're finding it hard to make their budgets they have to do at their base sites. So they're looking at ways to save money, and one of them is like custodial contracts, for example, and trying to get the contract off the procurement list and then work with a local municipality and county, and then they in turn would obviously subcontract out, because counties and towns don't have custodial crews. And the reason for that is literally to cut the pay in half and not provide benefits. That's happening. So I guess I'm looking for your advice, how to educate and change that thought process that's going on right now. And we understand that they're trying to save costs now, with it going up to $16 an hour. And in most of these states we're talking about, the minimum wage is under $8 an hour. So literally people who are homeowners are gonna lose their homes. And they're using the Intergovernmental Services Agreement to make this happen. And there are plans, in Tennessee as an example, in July, to use the new language that was put into play in the NDAA last year to actually do this. So we're under that gun right now, and we're having those conversations. We were on the Hill yesterday, met with Senator Blackburn's team. So what is your advice in these situations? Because this is just one, the plan is to expand it out. The Army does have that plan to literally cut people's pay in half.
Wow. I would have to say, are they looking at the big picture, right? That would be my question. Because from what you explained, I don't think so. I think, or what I'm taking away is the decision is kind of short-sighted. And again, I don't know all the particulars. But if we put people in a position where they're on a path to lose their homes, then somehow that is going to have to be addressed, right? Again, as I talked earlier about on the back end, right? So what's going to happen is your taxes are going to go up, because we've got to provide a means to take care of those individuals. So if you cut their pay on the front end and you put them in dire straits, okay, you're going to pay for it on the back end. So it just, to me, it just does not make sense.
They're going to save the Army's not going to get hit on the back end. The local municipality might, but the Army's going to save money, because they're going to be, the contracts are going to get cut in half, literally what they're paying out.
Right.
So the Army's not going to have that impact.
Okay, so but what I'm saying is, yeah, it may not be the Army that's feeling the impact, but society, okay, the state, this municipality will feel the impact, right? So it's like you save here, but then it balloons up over here. And that's why I'm saying, I don't think the big picture is being taken into account. And again, that's something that we try to educate our contracting officers on. You can't just think about what's here, immediately. What is the immediate need, and that's it. We've got to be more strategic in how we approach things like this.
I wonder if there needs to be a pull of data on the cost of IGSAs to
Yes.
the rest of the federal government.
Yeah. See, again, that would bring in the big picture. That's looking at everything involved here.
I love data.
Marissa, she loves data.
Hi.
She probably can help with that. Yeah.
Ashley Strackpine from ServiceSource. Thanks to the panel. I appreciate all of the comments that were made. Julie, I have a question for you, and a comment first. I think, well, at least ServiceSource, and I don't think I'm speaking on behalf of too many NPAs, that we agree with you and your comment about the strategic plan and moving away from CIE, and that was a concern for a lot of us in the second iteration of the plan. And along those lines, you spoke about this fear that maybe you had in the past and has changed over time, especially when you were able to visit and interact more with an NPA or NPAs and their contracts. How can the NPAs overcome some of this fear and, frankly, a misconception that the disability community has that we typically operate in segregated environments with our employees? And I think a lot of us would say that's the exception, not the rule, and whereas other people see it the other way around.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I promise this wasn't set up, and I am not here to do a Melwood commercial. But here's the truth of the matter. Melwood is a great example of an organization that knocked on our door and said, please come have a conversation. And I think, a lot of times in our space, perception is reality, right? So the perception of the AbilityOne program when APSE was founded in the late 1980s, and we were just starting to think about what supported employment is as a different model to support pathways for people with disabilities into employment. There's a lot of history involved in why communities believe what they believe. But it takes a willingness to have difficult conversations. I think we've tried, I've tried. Sometimes I don't know why my board lets me leave the office. But to be willing to have difficult conversations, and we can do that respectfully. But I would say if you are doing the work, then you need to be raising your hand and saying, please come look at us. Because you're your own best advocacy, right? And don't take no for an answer. And I will say that wearing a different hat of being part of the broader disability advocacy community, which is really quick to villainize, but has never stepped foot in some of these settings to see the possibility. So I guess that's my response, that when good work is being done, please lift it up. But also, I think with Melwood, we have been able to have real conversations about where we're not where we want to be. And Larissa and her leadership, she's willing to say, yeah, we could be doing better on that, and here's why I can't. And takes the time to help explain it in a way that we then can build into our advocacy points. So it sounds really simple, but it's relationship building and having an open mind. And at the end of the day, all APSE members care about is addressing the gap in the labor participation rate, period. There are many, many, many approaches, many models, many programs that are required to get us there. AbilityOne's just one of them. But we need to be open to the idea that every avenue that is out there that is funded, and this is one that is funded, right? Like, how do we take advantage of every one of those opportunities to really move the needle?
Yeah. One of the things that's on us as nonprofits in the program is we've been really good at serving people with disabilities and employing people with disabilities and having that be our sole focus for a long time. I mean, Melwood didn't have an advocacy or government relations department until like 4 years ago. And part of the reason our name is out there is because the amazing Julian Cosgrove, who just got named one of the top 10 or one of the top lobbyists for Melwood, which is great. Thank you. But I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the NPAs that are here include TVS and DidLake and GCE and ServiceSource, because, there's a lot of us out there that are being seen on the Hill as exceptions, because we're the ones who are raising our voices and coming to talk about the competitive integrated jobs we have, the CIE designations we've been given by VR agencies, and we need more of us to do that, and we need to, frankly, do it together. And do it. So it's not, I don't want to just be Melwood. Melwood's the exception, because we're not. I think, as Ashley said, or somebody else said, actually, I think it's the exception is the folks that are doing sheltered workshops in 14C, because there are so many of us across the country that, while JWAD hasn't changed, we have changed, and we've changed the way we do business. We've changed the way we do employment.
And just to add to that a little bit of credibility to what Larissa said, we have had a lot of AbilityOne providers who have been APSI members for decades, but never talked about it. Heaven forbid,
It was a bad
10 years
word.
ago, you went to an APSI conference and said, I have an AbilityOne contract. I'm telling you, we would have pushed you out of the room. But there are a handful of folks, Melwood, Skookum, who have been willing to have the conversation and raise their hand and say, will you look at us a little bit differently? And I agree that there are bad actors in every aspect of society. But I think we're in a different place in 2022 and have to be willing to be open to the conversation. That doesn't mean that APSI has swung 180 degrees the opposite direction and we're not going to continue to advocate, particularly on the product side, pushing on JWAD reform, all of those things that we need to do to really get to CIE. But I think we can do that and lift up success and really lift up where people are trying to do the best thing within the frameworks that they have.
And what a strong note to end on. So thank you, Larissa, Julie, and Melissa. And thank you all. Take it away.
Thank you all so much. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to take about a 10-minute break to be able to come back. So please go refresh your coffees, have some water, get some of those rolls if you haven't had a chance to eat a snack, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes.
Don't take no for an answer.
Yes.
You're welcome.